PowerPoint?
I can pull it over and pull it in front of them on the wall. So
that's fine, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to buzz through some of that material on the Palestinian or on the authorship issues.
Yep.
And see if we can get into, try to get through this stuff. I know that can be a little eye glazing, but it is also one of the, you can't pick up a commentary on Ezekiel without dealing with some of this stuff. And so, all right. So I think the one that I'm on right now is the slide 10, and it should say authorship, why a Palestinian Ezekiel. Have you got that one?
Yep.
Okay. Then I'll dive into it here. We'll finish out the last 50 minutes or so. There was a reason why, just so you know, the scholars who have looked at Ezekiel, they weren't just trying to, destroy your faith in the text. That wasn't their goal per se. What they were doing is they were trying to do a close analysis of it. But of course, in the process, what ends up happening is people's faith starts being questioned. Their faith starts being shaken, I should say. And so what they were doing is they were asking questions of the text. And one of the things that they were questioning is, it seems like when Ezekiel is talking, he uses this term, the house of Israel. And if that is the case, why is he addressing the house of Israel and not the exiles? So that was the first thing that they pointed out. The second thing was that he said they saw that there was a total silence on the hardships of the exile. They were saying, look, if Ezekiel's in exile, wouldn't he be, complaining about the hardships of the exile? It sounds like maybe it's the guy is back in Palestine. In other words, that he's back in Judah and that he is not actually in the exile. And the third thing that they noted is the fact that he seems to be very pro-Babylonian, and that just flew in the face of what scholars thought would be the normal thing that would happen if you were in exile. You would hate the place you were in and you would say, this is a horrible thing. This is a horrible place. And so they were expecting him to be very much against Babylon, but instead he seems to be very pro-Babylonian. The final thing is, number 4, Ezekiel seems to know the religious and political issues that are going on in Judah, especially in chapters 8 to 11 and 12. He knows the sins that are going on in Jerusalem. He knows what's going on in the temple. He knows, the actions of Zedekiah and how he is rebellious. And the question is, how does he know all of that? And of course, so the scholars, the German scholars especially, looked at this and they said it has to be explained away based upon the fact that he's not actually in Babylon. He must be in Palestine. Well, I looked at this, and there are some really good reasons why this is the case, that he would have all of these characteristics and still be in Babylon. So I want to just quickly look at each one of these, the way I would interpret them and ways other scholars have interpreted them and kind of debunked this whole concept. The very first one, the language house of Israel, not to the exiles. He addresses both. Consistently, he uses the language of the house of Israel, and he also talks to the exiles. So that type of language is to me is more splitting of hair and semantics than anything else. You can easily talk to the house of Israel and still be addressing exiles. They're still the house of Israel. And someone like Ezekiel, who was both a priest and a prophet, easily would have made that connection. And it would be just as natural when I'm in Israel, I often talk about the Americans, the Canadians, and whatnot, even though we're in Israel. So to me, that's not an issue. The second one, the silence and the hardships of the exile, early on, especially when you read the accounts of Ezekiel and you start reading chapters 1 to 3, it doesn't seem that someone like Ezekiel, who was kind of in a higher position, it doesn't seem like it was very difficult for them. In other words, Jeremiah talks about this in chapter 29, if I recall, where he says, I want you to settle down. I want you to plant vineyards. I want you to, marry and just enjoy your time there, because you're going to be there for 70 years. And so it doesn't seem like they were all under the whip, so to speak, to be slaves, but that the Babylonians actually used them quite well. From an archaeological perspective, we know this is actually the case. We know that they have found records in Babylon, ancient Babylon, showing the rations that were given. We know according to the biblical text that Jehoiakim is actually brought into the king's house and is given a regular food ration and eats at the king's table. We know according to the Melech seals that they have found in ancient Israel, that there were people who were still apparently gleaning gathering the king's produce and sending it to Babylon to help support the king, both Jehoiachin and Nebuchadnezzar. So as far as this being in some way a hardship, well, yeah, it wasn't ideal, that's for sure, but it wasn't as much of a hardship as when we think, for example, of a gulag or something like that in ancient or in modern Russia. One of the other things that we see as far as number 3, the fact that he's pro-Babylonian, this was actually one of the quiz questions. The reason that he's pro-Babylonian is pretty straightforward. But Ezekiel and Jeremiah both see Babylon as being the finger of God, or the hand of God, I should say, extended in judgment. And so Ezekiel is even more pro-Babylonian than Jeremiah. Jeremiah is somewhat pro-Babylonian. Matter of fact, he is perceived as being in some way a Babylonian sympathizer because he's so pro-Babylonian. On the other hand, Ezekiel, because he is living right in Babylon, is actually, he sees them just as kind of like his caretakers. And so he does not have a lot of you can leave that on. I'm going back in. He sees it actually as the people who are taking care of him. The last one, number 4, he knows the religious and political issues of Judah. Why would he know the religious and political issues in Judah? What would be the natural reason for this? If you've been
updates like others have.
Okay, so he's getting updates. According to Jeremiah chapter 29, we know that Jeremiah is writing letters, yes? They're writing back and forth, and they're communicating. But what do we see according to Ezekiel chapters 8 to 11? What actually happens for him to see what's going on in Jerusalem?
Vision. Oh, yeah.
A spiritual vision. He is actually taken there by the Spirit. And of course, if you are a rationalist and you're a German scholar and you're looking at this and you're saying, this is impossible, God doesn't act this way, then you can understand why they would argue against this. And for me, like I said, I look at this and I said, of course, I come from a Pentecostal background, and according to Joel chapter 2, I know that people see visions and dreams and whatnot. And so I have no problem with the supernatural. And so when I'm looking at Ezekiel being taken by the Spirit and seeing what's going on in Jerusalem, I take that at face value. And I say, God showed him through the Spirit of what was going on. After all, he is a prophet. And so for the most part, those types of arguments, I do not see them as being kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, if you move to the next slide, slide 11, you will see some names here, and I just want you to jot the names down. I don't ask you to know the dates per se, but there are a couple guys that were right at the turn of the 19th century, so late 19th century, early 20th century. These are the guys who are really pushing for more of a unified perspective. And so you have this guy by the name of Rudolf Smend. He was a German guy. He argued, look, this book is unified. The message is unified. It seems like it's coming out of Babylon. Then in England, a guy by the name of Samuel S.R. Driver, he actually argued in 1910, look, even though this, the historical critical method is dominated, he agreed with Smend. He said, look, this book is unified. And if you start kind of taking it apart and taking pieces out, it's not going to make sense. And as I was studying the text, that's exactly what I was finding, is that if you remove any part of this, if you remove chapters 40 to 48, or you take out chapters 37 to 39, something is missing out of his message, and it doesn't make sense. It's no longer unified. Now, if you go to the next slide, slide 12, you will see some of the challenges to this unity that took place. And one of the leading guys was this guy by the name of Gustav Hulscher. He is one of the ones I think was on your quiz as a bonus. And I spend a little bit of time talking about him in the textbook. But he comes around 1924, and this is right at the height. I mean, it is the historical critical method and the challenge to authorship, the challenge to the whole concept of prophecy. This is when it's taken place. And of course, 1924, he argued, he was kind of the extreme. He argued only 150 to 170 verses total of the entire book of Ezekiel was from Ezekiel. Everything else was by somebody else. there was a guy by the name of William Andrew Irwin in 1943. This is kind of when he was writing. He's following this similar line of reason. So he's within, 20 years roughly of Holscher, and he's basically saying, yeah, that makes sense to me. This book is probably a compendium of a bunch of different guys writing at a later date. There's probably very little that we can actually assign to Ezekiel. If you go to slide 13, the last guy I want to look at, this is and again, this kind of takes you to the extreme, even beyond Holscher. Holscher was still saying, look, Ezekiel may have written some of this, even though it's 150, 170 verses. But then you have this guy by the name of Leopold Zunz. And what you'll notice is this guy is actually prior to, he's back from the 1700s into the 1800s, but it's his thinking that has actually now, for the most part, influenced a lot of German and European scholars who've argued that this is nothing more than a pseudepigraph, that it is written from a much later time period and that it's written under the guise of Ezekiel, much like the book of Enoch or the Testament of Abraham, the Testament of Moses, and so forth. And so I just wanted to give you a few of those names and kind of give you an overview of how scholars from that time period, over the period of the late 1800s, early 1900s, into the mid-20th century, we're actually looking at the book of Ezekiel. And the only reason I do that is not to drive you to tears for boring you, but it's to understand that when you pick up a text, when you pick up a commentary, they are being written from a perspective. And you should be able to identify that perspective based upon that overview that I gave you. And you can tell pretty quickly when someone says, well, this was a later edition by somebody in Palestine, you'll know exactly where they're coming from. Is that clear? Yeah. So that's why I do that. Because some of you are going to, I guess all of you are going to be writing commentary or papers for me, and I want you to be able to evaluate. Again, this is part of the spiritual discipline of study and being able to evaluate the sources that you have in front of you, because not all sources are equal. That's for sure. Yes.
So I just think it's interesting, the timeline of the theology and thinking coming out of Germany in regard to the leadership of Hitler.
Yeah.
I started seeing the timing of the people who were challenging the scriptures. It just jumped out at me that it was during the time of Hitler's leadership they were coming against God.
Yeah, what's interesting is that anti-Semitism, for the most part, was on the rise within the church at that particular time. And it was already there. I mean, Hitler just had to stoke what's already there. It was already showing up in the scholarship. And this is where the church, for the most part, had missed, kind of had dropped the ball spiritually. Of course, I don't know whether you're familiar with a guy by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Yeah. I'm assuming you probably are familiar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He is in the church. He's a young man in the church when Hitler comes to power. And at first, he's a pacifist. He's standing back. And from a spiritual perspective, and this is what teaches as far as from a spiritual formation perspective, he is watching how scholarship has fueled the ability for anti-Semitism to take over. And, because he's training under some of these guys. He knows, he's gone through seminary. He knows what's going on. And it comes to the point, of course, we know the story by late 1944, late 1945, he mounts or gets involved in a coup to have Hitler assassinated. And of course, he gets caught, and it's going to cost him his life. But he gave up pacifism in this case because he recognized the fact unless somebody does something, we're in serious trouble. And of course, he, as a Bible-believing Christian, he recognized the fact that the church had been silent on this, and a lot of it had stemmed from the way scholarship had been viewing the Bible. And the fact that the church, I don't know whether you're familiar with the terminology, whether you've had this in your theology classes, but there's a term called replacement theology. And it's very common, even in some places today. Replacement theology is where the church replaces Israel in the Bible. And so all of the promises to Israel are now picked up with the church, and therefore God is done with geopolitical Israel. Therefore, we don't have to have anything to do with them, and we don't have to bless them. We don't have to pray for them because they are basically pagan, and the church is now the new spiritual Israel. That was the thinking that was birthed out of Europe, and you can see in the case with some of these scholars who are coming up through the ranks right in the time period of Nazi Germany, why they were thinking the way they were thinking. And that's why they turned a blind eye. Most of them turned a blind eye to what was going on in the prison camps and in places like Auschwitz.
They just
unfortunately
getting what they deserved.
Yeah, they were basically, they would see them as being punished for the way they treated Christ, but more importantly, they are rejected by God. God has rejected them. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the promises to Israel through Abraham and the promises to Israel through the prophets, Ezekiel being one.
Didn't a lot of that concept, though, came directly from Luther and some of his later writings?
Yes. Luther was very anti-Semitic.
Yes. Initially, he was not, but when he couldn't get his Jewish friends to convert to Christianity, then he turned against them.
Yep.
He started writing all bad things about them. And Hitler picked up on a lot of this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as I said, I don't know, there was this class, those who do not study are bound to study history are bound to repeat it. In this case, Ezekiel was very familiar with, Luther was very familiar with, some of the pogroms that had happened throughout history. But for some strange reason, like you say, towards the end of his life, he changes his perspective. And this is going to carry over into the seminaries, and a lot of them are Lutheran. A lot of these guys who are proposing these theories are Lutheran and coming from that tradition. It's unfortunate. Because had the church done spiritually what they were supposed to do, and had they understood history and understood how to handle the text, and that's why we need to study, I'm glad they have classes like this on Ezekiel, where you can actually study what do the prophets actually say, because you get to Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48, or even let's go back to chapters 34 to 39, that certainly sounds like geopolitical Israel today. And that certainly does not sound like the church. And when I look at that text, that's why I have no problem saying God has a plan for Israel. And what's going on over in the Middle East right now, I take note of it. It's kind of scary. Let me give you a very brief story. When I was doing my first master's level work down in Birmingham, Alabama, I was at a place called Beeson Divinity School. And it's a great school, but they every year they would bring someone in from around the world who was an evangelical scholar, and they would have special lectures for a week. Well, when I was there, they brought in a guy from Ireland. He's an ethicist. I just lost his name. Isn't that terrible? It's too late at night.
It happens to all of them.
Yeah.
Keep talking, it'll come.
Yeah.
It will come to me. It will come to me. I can see his face. Anyway, he was an ethicist, and I know you'll know the name. I will come up with it. And I was asked by the administration, "Will you go with him to supper?" There's a couple of the students, they want to take him out to supper. We want you to go with him. And so I said, "Sure, I'll go." I had recognized the guy's name from some of the textbooks I had. And so I went out with him to supper, and on the way, driving, I couldn't resist. I said, "So what do you think about Israel?" Kind of get the feel for where they are. And he says, geopolitical Israel has nothing to do with Scripture today. And I'm like, our understanding of Scripture. And I was kind of taken aback, and I was like, "Really?" I said, "How do you see that?" And he said, "The church has taken over all the promises of Israel." And I can remember at the time when I heard that, and of course then I kind of silent, I was just the student. He was the PhD guy. He was there for special lectures. But I began to realize how replacement theology, it still is dominant in places in Europe even today. And of course, this guy was from Ireland. Is it Christopher Wright? I think it's Christopher Wright. the ethicist, or does Old Testament ethics. Yeah. So anyway, are there any other questions before I move on? All right. Can you move to the slide on number 14? The heading should be James Muhlenberg. You got that?
Got it.
Okay. James Muhlenberg. So you got some notes there on James Muhlenberg. Just so you know, you've got all these on your web pages. The reason I have stop and talk a little bit about James Muhlenberg, because he is the guy that really opened the door for scholars to do what I'm doing in my textbook, or in my book, Ezekiel in Context. In 1968, James Muhlenberg looked at a lot of these methods that have been applied to the Bible, form criticism, redaction criticism, source criticism, and so forth. These are the things that are being used, obviously, by these scholars that I've just spoken about. And he said, look, at the end of the day, while they had their, they have their strengths and weaknesses, we really need to spend more time looking at the final form of the text. Because after all, that's what we have in front of us. We cannot recreate a Palestinian Ezekiel. We cannot recreate a Babylonian Ezekiel. What we have is in front of us. And so he gave an address called Form Criticism and Beyond. And in it, he argued for a more holistic approach to the text. And this opened up the door for what is known as rhetorical criticism. And that's the approach that I took in this particular book. And in rhetorical criticism, what it is it's you're looking at what the argument of the author is. And that's what when I went through the entire book, and I don't know whether you've probably already seen this in the textbook, but I have a little, I think, try to find the page that it's on. I have a little drawing of the actual book of Ezekiel, kind of in a chart. Have you come across that yet? No. Okay, then don't look it up, because I'm going to question you on something. If you haven't, then this is good, because I just assumed you already had, so I was just going to use it. But what I argued within the book, what I was trying to get across is, if you look at the argument that Ezekiel is trying to get across, it makes perfect sense based upon the way the visions are organized. And what I was arguing throughout is that because this is unified, and I'm using this more holistic approach, this what is called a rhetorical approach, this is going to, I think, bring the text much like Brevard Childs. And you can see at the bottom of this particular slide on James Muhlenberg, that that holistic approach paved the way for other approaches like narrative criticism. But the one that I want to focus on is the canonical and the rhetorical. Canonical criticism is when you look at the book in the final form, and why are the chapters organized the way they are? Why are books organized the way they are? And rhetorical criticism is kind of the argument that's being made. I often joke with my students and I tell them I am the grandson of Brevard Childs. My PhD director trained under Brevard Childs in the 1980s at Yale University. And so when I trained under Dr. Taylor, I was getting kind of that second generation perspective. And so he had a very high view of Scripture, and he had used this holistic approach. And so when I proposed a rhetorical argument for Ezekiel to approach the book from that perspective, he was all for it, because he understood that holistic approach. Well, that holistic approach, I think, is what saves the day, so to speak, and brings back the theological perspective of this particular book. And so if you will switch to the next slide, I will address, I think it was Ralph who had noted, how do the Jewish scholars deal with it? While most of them are minimalists and would argue, much like the Western perspective, that you can't really trust what's there, and that it's probably a bunch of different people who have written it. This guy here by the name of Moshe Greenberg, great scholar, and literally there are probably a dozen different scholars that are of his caliber who have come to this conclusion. But he passed away in 2010. But one thing that you'll find in his writings, and if you're doing any work on Ezekiel, any commentaries or anything that he has written, I suggest that you pull it out and have a look at it. It's worth the read. because he has a very high view of the book of Ezekiel. But what he does, he takes these scholars to task, these earlier scholars. And he said, what they were doing was extremely arbitrary. And this kind of a priori argument, in other words, just pulling it out of thin air without any proof. He said, look, when you're looking at what we see here in Ezekiel, he said, most of what we are seeing in Ezekiel could not be from anybody but from a guy who's living in the exile. And so he argued for very much a holistic approach, and he rooted his discussion more in that canonical approach, in the final form. He said, look, when you get that final form in front of you, and you start looking at the rhetoric that's being used in the argument that Ezekiel is proposing, it has to be unified. He said, you cannot read it any other way. And so that's hopefully the last of the names that I will use here on you. But from that point on, what you get within scholarship, and fortunately, most of the scholarship that has come out since the 1980s, roughly, on Ezekiel, unless it's coming out of German scholarship, out of Germany and Europe, will see, for the most part, Ezekiel is unified. And so that's where I'm going to move forward from that perspective, that we have a unified message here, and it's very important that we read it as such, because if we don't, we do him a disservice. Are there any questions on that before we move on to some of the other aspects of Ezekiel, kind of get back into the world of Ezekiel?
So what we're seeing here on a spiritual level is very much a spiritual warfare thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Coming against the truth of the scripture.
There's no question that at what was going on at the turn of the century, and it's still prevalent today, but what was going on is an attack on the authority of the text.
Yeah.
So let's say in the book of Ezekiel, if I take away the authority and the supernatural aspect and the revelation of Ezekiel, say from chapters 34 onward, what I have done is I have removed all of the prophetic aspect, and I no longer have to look at Israel, or I no longer have to think that there is a coming day of judgment, because that was all it's just good made up story. These approaches, for the most part, did not start out to undermine the text. Most of these scholars who were working in Germany, especially in the mid to late 19th century, were fine churchmen. Unfortunately, they were trained very much in the ways of Luther, and from that thinking of anti-Semitism, and they started addressing it more from a rationalistic perspective. And hey, I'm all for rationalism in the sense of using your head, but I'm also very much open my heart spiritually to what the Spirit is doing in the text. And that's, again, I can teach Ezekiel, I can give you all the facts until I'm blue in the face, but if the spiritual aspect does not come alive, if that doesn't encourage you to study and dig deeper, what good am I doing? You just got a head full of facts. And that's why time and time again, I will try to bring in the importance of the spiritual disciplines as you're reading through this and pondering on the text and reading the text and challenging the scholarship that you're reading. And I say, when you read my text, hopefully you will challenge. If you have questions, go for it. Because, like I said, I'm not infallible, that's for sure. But the text of Scripture is. I don't know whether this will help explain it. I'll step over to the other board just for a couple minutes. And I want to show you why these approaches, kind of sum this up and conclude it, what they're actually trying to do. And what is going on today, because I've basically stopped you at two different perspectives or two different levels of biblical study. There is a third level of study that's going on today that's even more sinister. And what I want to do is I'll just take a minute and I'll show you what those are. So I'll use the full board. I'm assuming that you can still hear me over here. Yes?
Yep.
Yep.
You can see me?
Yep.
All right. I am going to draw here. This is the Bible. This, when we're dealing with the text, what scholars, everything that I had just talked about, and I talked about source criticism, I talked about a little bit form criticism and beyond. Again, these were different approaches. These were the approaches that these guys were using. Redaction criticism, All of these are literary approaches, and what they were trying to do, so they were kind of tearing the book apart. That's where you get sources. For example, a Palestinian Ezekiel, a Babylonian Ezekiel. Form criticism is kind of looking at the different little stories. Someone like Gustav Holscher, he would argue that there's really all of the material in there, very minimal, very little bit of it was from Ezekiel. And redaction, he would argue as well, that a lot of it was added or edited and added later. Well, what were these guys actually doing? They were attacking or approaching the text. I shouldn't say attacking, but they were approaching the text from behind it. So here's the Bible, here's the final form, this is what we have. What they were doing is they were trying to get behind the text. So I understand what they were trying to do in the sense of, figure out how that book came into existence. In this case, the book of Ezekiel. They wanted to know, how did we get the book of Ezekiel? So they're working behind the text. Now, I talked about holistic approaches. I don't know can you still see me here?
Yep.
Okay. So we talked about rhetorical approaches, canonical. Brevard Childs came up with this. Rhetorical criticism is James Muhlenberg. What they were actually doing is they were working in the text. They were trying to get at the final form and trying to get kind of the argument that was being used by the author. In other words, looking at it more holistically. Does that make sense? So they are working within the text. Now, what we have today is what is called, so this is in the text, this is behind the text. Now let's look at in front of the text. I think you can still see that. In front of the text, now we have different approaches that approach the text, and they're trying to interpret it in light of their experience. And so think of it from the perspective of putting a mirror up to the Bible, and they want to see themselves in the mirror. And so we have things like, I don't know whether any of this language is familiar to you, but a womanist approach. That means I'm a black woman and I'm going to read the Bible as a black woman. We have things like the feminist approach. In other words, I am a feminist, so therefore I'm going to read it, and anything I see in there that's patriarchy or anything that is presenting a harsh picture of women, I'm going to denounce it. And so, for example, let me give you one case in particular when it comes to the book of Ezekiel. There is a scholar, and you can find her name in my bibliography. And in I think it's in chapter 3, when I get to chapter 16 and I start unpacking chapter 16 and 23, I'm going to talk about the feminist approach to the Bible. Catherine Pfister-Darr is one of them, one of the scholars who is an Ezekiel scholar. She actually approaches the text from a feminist perspective. And she says when she gets to chapter 16, chapter 23, and some of those texts, she said, I refuse to accept that this is the God of the Bible. I refuse to accept that any God would do this. So therefore, I reject that because I have placed a mirror up to the text, and what I want to see a God basically in my image. And so therefore, because I don't like it, I am going to reject it. Now, we laugh at that, but this is, there's a whole realm of scholarship that deals with it from this perspective. And so this is women feminists, and I'm a Pentecostal, and unfortunately, we have what is called a Pentecostal approach. And in this case, this can, in some cases, work very well, in some cases, not so well. It's where you look at the text, and now you interpret everything. What is the Spirit telling you within the text? Can be good, can also be very bad if it's used improperly. What about something like, I don't know whether you've seen this before, queer hermeneutic?
Yes.
Liberation.
Bible for that.
What's that?
They have a new Bible with that hermeneutic.
Yeah, there's an entire Bible now written by from that perspective. So I said all of that to say this. When you're reading the text, this is why I adhere to approaches that are in the text. And so when you're looking for good sources for study, for preaching, for teaching, you want to find approaches that are working within the text and that are taking the Bible holistically, because it is the Bible that is our final rule of faith. All of those other approaches, they may be interesting to read, but at the end of the day, they're all theoretical. And even though my approach may be theoretical, I am basing my argument within the text itself. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any questions on that before we move on to Ezekiel? Next week, we are going to be in the book of Ezekiel. I trust you. Trust me. Any questions? Okay. Then let's move on to the next slide, slide 16. What I want to look at on this particular slide, and I've talked a little bit about this, I just want to touch on a couple things. I've noted that both Ezekiel and Daniel were probably re-educated, and this is noted in Daniel chapter 1. The reason I believe that is because as a priest, he was a literate individual. In other words, he could read and write because he had to teach and study the Torah. We do know that he probably had access to the Babylonian city that was near him, the city of Nippur. So if you can just switch to the next slide just for a minute, you will see that you can see on the map, I know it's very small, but you will notice that the river Tel Aviv, where he was, the river Chebar, Tel Aviv is only a few miles, probably within 8 to 10 miles from Nippur. And it was very close to Babylon. And so we do know that if you're traveling around and you're in Babylon, you can't help but conclude that as a priest, Ezekiel probably would have come into contact with some of those pagan priests. And so we do know that if you're coming into contact with them and they're retraining them, the way that the ancients retrained people is they would take texts, and the texts were often stored in places like religious centers and also in city gates. And so they would have places for almost like libraries. We know that there were libraries in ancient Nineveh and so forth. And so we do know that access that he probably had in the training, they would take these texts and have their scribes transcribe them, and that's how they learned to write in cuneiform. And you can read about that. I write a little bit about that in my textbook. And so because he was so close to these cities, Babylon and Nippur, the odds of him being retrained and being introduced to some of these texts, very important. Now, while I think of it, I would like you for next week and this one is a lot shorter. I think that I have uploaded it already, but it's called A Vision of the Netherworld. If it is not there, could someone please send me an email and I'll make sure that I upload it for you. It is only about a page and a half long, but I want you to read it over and you kind of get a feel for what I'm trying to get across and why I think Ezekiel is familiar with some of these ancient texts, and that God is using these to kind of help formulate a message. And it's not, and this is, hear me well, this is not a mere borrowing. This is done, I believe, by God and by Ezekiel to put the fear of God into the people who are in exile. And he is actually using some of the very things that they're going to be seeing around them on a daily basis, and he's going to use those as a teaching tool. And so if you would, the pages are 109 and 110 on the ancient Near Eastern texts. And like I said, it's the title is A Vision of the Netherworld. Are there any questions on that? We good?
Good.
All right, just a few more minutes and then I'll let you go. All right. One of the reasons that I argue that there is some borrowing going on as far as exchange of culture and cultural ideas is that on the very last portion of slide 16, we do know that Babylon and Assyria exchanged cultural literature and whatnot through conquest. We just talked about what happened to the Neo-Babylonian Empire to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Well, when the Assyrian Empire, the old Assyrian Empire, conquered Babylon, one of the things that we know, the particular king, the king's name is Tukulti-Ninurta. It also appears in the Tukulti-Ninurta epic, and this is from about 1200 BC. In that list of the things in that epic, he actually notes that when they sacked Babylon all the way back there in 1200 BC, one of the things that they took is their library. And so they would literally take the books, and they're not books as we think of them, but the clay tablets. They would take them back, the scrolls and everything back, and then they would read them and adopt these ideas. That is why you have a lot of these stories. For example, Gilgamesh, you have the story of the Enuma Elish, you have these creation myths and flood myths. That is why they are prolific across the ancient world and why they're finding them everywhere. My goodness, they've even found some Mesopotamian texts all the way down in Egypt. So we know that they were exchanging ideas. And so this would be stuff that the Israelites in exile would start hearing about. If not reading it, they would definitely hear about it orally. And so I think it's within this context that it's very important that we recognize the fact that this is not being unspiritual or non-spiritual to say that God uses kind of the culture of the day to minister. I know it's probably not the best example, but, and I always struggle with this language, but they talk about Christian rock and roll. I struggle with, I was a drummer for a long time, and while I liked upbeat music, I often struggled with the language of Christian rock and roll, because anybody who grew up in the 60s knows exactly what that means. That term came out of a sexual act back in the 60s, and that was the language they used, and it stuck. And so some of the language, while I don't like it, I do recognize that God can use music styles to minister to people, and so culture does change. Now, I think it always has to be put through the lens of the Bible, and through and be judged whether it is a good thing or a bad thing. And so I have no problem with the fact that God is using their culture and some of these things to help Ezekiel formulate his message. Now, if you move to the next slide, slide 17, that has the map on it, one of the things that you'll notice about this is the fact that God is, in chapter 1 of Ezekiel, God is going to call Ezekiel in a foreign land. Now, why should this even be a major concern? Well, we have to put this in context, because in the ancient world, a lot of, and even Israelites and Jewish people, did not believe that their gods could appear in a foreign land. They were very territorial. And so, for example, if you read Psalm 137, does anybody know what Psalm 137 is actually about? Yes, no?
No.
By the rivers of Babylon, there they asked us to sing the songs of Zion. And they said, how can we sing the songs of Zion here in Babylon? There we hung up our harps. Why are they saying that? That's a post-exilic psalm. Why are they saying that? Or it's an exilic psalm, I should say. It's because their thinking was, we cannot worship God in a foreign country, because God is back in the temple. God is in Israel. Does anybody know the story in 1 Kings, got it right. 2 Kings chapter 5, where you have a guy by the name of Naaman, and he is a Syrian, not Assyrian, but he is Syrian, just as. And he comes down and he finds a guy by the name of Elisha, and he asks him to heal him of leprosy. Yes, you know the story? After he is healed of leprosy, what does Naaman ask for? To pay. He wants to pay Elisha, and Elisha said, I don't want your money. Instead, he said, okay, if you won't take my money, can I have one thing? What does Naaman ask for? Does anybody know?
Oh, that's right. He asked for, isn't it some dirt from the Holy Land so that he can have
He asked for 2 donkey loads of dirt. Sorry, Desiree, you were cutting out. He was asking for, he said, give me 2 donkey loads of dirt. And we read that today and we're like, why did he want 2 donkey loads of dirt? It was because his thinking was, from very much ancient Near East, in order to worship God, you have to be on Israeli soil. If you're worshiping Yahweh, he's the great God who healed me. So what he did, he took his piles of dirt back, made a sandbox, dumped all of his Israeli dirt in it, and stood on it and prayed, because now he's on Israel's soil. That was the thinking. Now, why do the exiles think it's impossible to praise God and to worship God in a foreign land? Because God isn't here. God doesn't see us. God is back in the temple. How can we worship God in a foreign land? Now, put that in the context of Ezekiel's call. And what happens? God comes and appears to Ezekiel in a foreign land, and calls him to be a prophet. What does that tell the Jewish people who are in exile? God is not bound by borders. God is actually a God of the entire universe. And so not only is Ezekiel being re-educated, so to speak, in the context of ancient Babylonian thinking and kind of their literature, but Ezekiel is re-educating, and God is re-educating the Jewish people who are in exile of what it means to serve the living God who is in control of everything and is not bound by borders. And what a better way to do that than to go and call his prophet in a foreign land. He's the only prophet ever called in a foreign land. I mean, you have Daniel, who is ministers in a foreign land and is used by God, but he is never called as a prophet. Only Ezekiel is called in a foreign land as a prophet. Are there any questions on that?
I was just wondering the thinking of that. Was it just superstitious or something? Because wouldn't they know about Abraham? And, you know, I don't know. It just doesn't make sense that they would have such a narrow view of God.
It is, and I think it's a view that developed over time, and this and that's not the only story. Naaman is not the only story, as is Psalm 137. Think about the same time period as Elijah, just before that, and the Syrians are attacking Israel, and God comes and tells the prophet to go tell the king, "You go here and fight them. They're hiding," and he wins. And what is the response of the Syrians? They said, well, it's because he's a god of the mountains. If we fight him in the valley, we'll win. And of course, God comes to him and says, go tell him they're hiding here. Go fight him there. So I'll show them that I am not just the God of the mountains. I am the God of the valleys as well. They had this understanding that Rimnon, for example, is the god of Syria. We have Baal, who is the god of Phoenicia. We have Marduk, who is the god of Babylon. And so forth. Nabu is the god, or Asher is the god, I should say, of Assyria. And so we are going to see this is going to play itself out when we get into Ezekiel, especially into chapters 8 through 11. This whole idea of the departure of Yahweh from his temple.
So like a lot of things that you just said remind me of that treaty you had us read. Where they had a treaty that you had us read for today.
Yes.
A lot of the God of this and the God of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question for every nation, they assumed that their God was the strongest. And of course, that's why when you're reading that treaty, Asher is the great God. Of course, he also lists, another 14, 15, 20 different gods. Yeah. We see the exact same thing happening in the ancient texts, for example, ancient Babylonian texts, where Marduk is listed along with 50 different other deities. In the text that you will read for next week, the vision of the netherworld, you'll see the same thing happening. They did a multiplicity of gods, and when you defeated another nation's god, what you do is you take their god out of the temple, the image, and you bring it over and you set it in the temple of your God. And what that says to all the people is that my God is stronger than your God, and now he is sitting at the feet of my God. Now stop and consider in 1 Samuel chapters 4 to 7, the Israelites are out in battle one day, and they take the Ark of the Covenant into battle because they want to make sure that they win the battle because, hey, we've got God in the box. And of course, God doesn't behave that way. And so what happens is the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant. And where do they take and put it?
In their temple. Oh, yeah.
In their temple at the feet of Dagon. And of course, what happens? They wake up the next morning. Dagon is laying on his face, prostrate before God. In other words, worshiping God. So they set him back up, and he come in the next day, and what happens to Dagon? But now his head is cut off, and his hands are cut off, and his hands are on the threshold. In other words, trying to get out of there. In other words, it's recognizing this. God has a sense of humor. And for these ancient Philistines who thought that their god Dagon was stronger and greater than the God of Israel, Yahweh, what they quickly learned is the God Yahweh is actually over all the nations, and Dagon bows before him. and Dagon is not a god. And so, yeah, this one of the interesting things about the ancient deities. If you did not want to take a deity and put it back in your temple, say you didn't want to drag it all that way, what if it's made out of gold and you want to keep the gold? But you don't want to just carry around a deity. What they would do is they would take knives or if it was a stone, they would break the heads off and break the hands off. And I know, Destry, you're probably familiar with this, because the same year we found the Hyksos scarab, we also found a little ram's head that had been decapitated at Kerb el Makader. And I wrote an article in one of the archaeological magazines and argued this was a decapitated deity. And of course, this makes sense that Joshua and his men would decapitate a bronze deity so they could use the bronze. So they neutered it. And so what does that say when Dagon fell before Yahweh and his head fell off? He was neutered. In other words, he is nothing. And so this is the same concept in the ancient world, that the gods were localized, and the way that you show the superiority of your deity is to take those gods back and put them in your temple, in their temples. So, well, I think I'm done. I've talked at you enough. What we will do next week is we'll do a little bit with, I'm just kind of looking at my PowerPoints here. We'll look a little bit at kind of the natures of treaties. There's just a few things that I want to talk about treaty to kind of pick up with your what you had read over this week and for next week. And then hopefully within about 20 minutes, half hour, we should be jumping into the book of Ezekiel and be away to the races after that. Any questions before I sign off?
Thank you.
All right, we'll have a quiz next week on, I think it is on pages, a little bit on the biblical text and you're reading. Of course, some of this is crossing over. The assignment is to read to page 96. So finish up chapter 1. That will give you all that background. And from after that, we're getting into the text itself. So yeah, we'll have a short quiz like we did this week. And I'll see how you did on your quizzes. If it's really bad, I'll have mercy on you. And I'll curve it. All right. You guys have a great night.
Thank you.
Good, thank you.
See ya.
I'm so glad he explained why we did this book. Because that is sometimes the whys really bother me, because it just bothers me when I see so many things coming against the Bible and that just